Hello, hello. Welcome to Common Censored. It's good to have you back. I didn't know if you were going to make it, and I was worried there, and I saw you running, and I was like, oh, God, I hope they get here in time. And you have.
Are you talking about me or?
No, talking to the listener.
Oh.
You're not involved right now. That was the voice of Eleanor Goldfield, who always joins me, and I am Lee Camp. And together we make up Common Censored, which is the show where we talk censored stories and people, sensible solutions, and common ground movements to fight and build.
And sometimes other stuff.
And sometimes other stuff. And it's good to have you back. Thank you to everyone in Philadelphia. We just enjoyed some wonderful shows there. We went to an anti-war protest put on by Answer Coalition.
We had some badass vegan food.
Yeah, a lot of good shit going on in Philly. Thank you, Philadelphia. And we're headed to, no, I guess you won't be there. Austin and Dallas. But I'm headed to Austin and Dallas in a month, and that's at leecamp.com. But let's move on to the quick updates on what's going on in the world. Some of this we keep shorter because we've covered it on our other shows. I did a video this week on Glenn Greenwald and what's going on there. Many of you probably already know about this, but it's too important not to talk about. Glenn Greenwald is being charged by the Brazilian government, the incredibly corrupt Brazilian government, with, suspicious or mysterious cyber crimes, basically, in his research, revealing their crimes. And basically, a leaker leaked to him tons of documents and texts and emails showing the crimes of the Brazilian government in locking up Lula da Silva, the incredibly popular two-term president, left-wing president. And they locked him up to pave the way for fascist Jair Bolsonaro.
It's another episode of when you expose the crimes of the state, you are the criminal.
Yeah, you become the criminal. And it's very similar to what the American government is doing to Julian Assange right now, although Glenn Greenwald, luckily, is not behind bars yet. The charges have been recommended, and I guess now they're waiting to see the next steps. But Glenn Greenwald has said he, plans to continue to fight it. He's staying in Brazil, where he's, where he lives with his husband and his kids, and so he doesn't want to flee and give up his life that he's created there. And it's understandable and incredibly brave. But
yeah, and vital that we keep watching this and show solidarity and support as much as we can. Yeah,
because a lot of these things depend on how much the public cares. I mean, it's so easy to disappear people, lock them up in prison when people are not talking about it. But the more we talk about it, the harder it is. And that's why it's been, I think, so hard for them to really lock up Julian Assange. I mean, they've succeeded in taking away his freedom for over 8 years now, but they have not technically yet locked him up for a crime. So it's incredibly fucked up that he's his health is fading and everything. And now the video I just did on online, if anybody wants to go to youtube.com/redacted tonight. I talked about Glenn Greenwald, but I also talked about how the head of WikiLeaks has said that the U.S. plans to use the argument that foreign journalists do not get freedom of press. I mean, that is so fucking horrifying on a level that we can't really comprehend. Like, imagine if because so many journalists report on American politics, American governance, all of it. And imagine all of them suddenly fearing they could be locked up for it.
Well, and it's a slippery slope, right? Because if you just look at the case of Assange, then every major corporate outlet, from the Washington Post to CNN to the New York Times, published what Assange had and WikiLeaks had published.
They used it.
They used it happily because it was fucking headline-worthy shit. And this is just, it's a slippery slope. So what they're going to say is that, well, if you're not an American citizen, then you don't have free press rights. Well, if you share anything by a non-American citizen that we've deemed espionage, then you don't have free, right? It's just like
Yeah.
they can continue to keep pulling those rights away, and in that sort of gradual space where, you know, it's like that famous quote, first they came for thee and I wasn't one, so I didn't fucking care. I kept watching Netflix. That's not exactly how the quote goes, but
I thought that was how the quote went, and they were in a time capsule, and
we're just adding layers of complications. But yeah,
that was written by a priest. Does that mean you're now a fan of priests?
Amen. No. No, I don't like any religious entities.
So, because I'm doing the quick thing, I'm trying to get better at it. I will move on.
Snap, go.
I'm moving on to the next topic.
I actually have a water bottle. You guys can't see it, but I have a water bottle. I'm spritzing him every time he takes too long on a topic.
I get sprayed for more than 63 seconds on any topic. So the DNC has now laid out their next plan to steal the primary from Bernie Sanders if he were to win it. Most of you listening already know the kind of most obvious plan to steal it, which is simply to do the same style of rigging as last time, whether it be, you know, lying on the numbers in an Iowa caucus or closing polling places in other states, or California I covered where they try and trick people who are independents from not, you know, thinking they don't have a right to vote in the presidential election. There's just a whole series of things. And then step 2 is to have a brokered convention where they push it to a secondary vote, and superdelegates all of a sudden come back into play and decide who the candidate is.
And if that sounds confusing, yes.
It's designed to sound confusing. But the latest thing is that DNC chair Tom Perez, a.k.a. Skeletor, has...
Oh, come on. Skeletor is way cooler.
At least Skeletor's got some purple going on.
He's fabulous.
So Tom Perez has announced who he's nominating to run the various platforms, and fill the various committees of each committee, each platform for the Democratic Convention. And the list is just a horror show of dipshits and assholes and Wall Street goons and
so who's who of people that don't give a flying fuck about people.
It's all former Hillary and Obama people. There's probably not. I'd be surprised if there's a single person on that list that isn't vehemently opposed to Bernie Sanders getting the nomination. Mm-hmm. And everyone's, luckily the stories are going viral and everyone's kind of talking about what a fucking sham it is to fill. We're talking about the rules committee, the platform committee, the credentials committee. So you decide who gets in the place. You decide all of these various rules in the bylaws of how the nomination process works. And they have a million tricks up their sleeves to make sure Bernie doesn't walk away with this thing. So that is something to, I'd say, keep your eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk to, and by the way, if you haven't seen Lee's Moment of Clarity video about this stuff, then do check that out. But Lee, do you want to talk about the oldie but baddie two-state solution?
So Trump came out and gave a wonderful talk today, and he trotted out his friend Netanyahu and in the White House, and they had a bunch of people around them who were clapping and celebrating, and it was a big moment after 3 years. Kushner's been working on this for 3 years, right? Trump's son-in-law, who he fucking hates, has been working on this for 3 years to reveal this peace plan. And Trump boldly said it is a two-state solution, and Netanyahu's signing off on this two-state solution. And then he goes through a bunch of other Trump phrase details that I will be playing on Redacted tonight this week, playing those clips and analyzing them. But basically, all you need to know, this is all you need to know about it. And, I don't know if anyone's seen the documents. I don't know if he's actually...
Alex Jones has.
Yeah, Alex Jones has them up his ass. But I don't know if anyone's actually seen the actual documents of it yet. But here's all you need to know. The Palestinians, any Palestinians, were not involved in any of it. None of it. There were no Palestinians, at least not any of note, at this event. There were none that signed off on it and said this sounds like a good idea. There were none involved in the 3-year process that Kushner had spent writing this thing. This is a grab bag for Israel with the title two-state solution so that enough nations around the world say, oh yeah, we want a two-state solution. Sounds good to us. And, I mean, how hilarious is it to announce this surrounded by billionaire Zionists like Sheldon Adelson, who have promoted and celebrated war crimes in Israel, the shooting of children, the shooting of journalists, the shooting of medics. That is their doing, and they're something they were very proud of. How crazy is it to encircle yourselves with them and evangelicals who want Jews to be in Israel so they can burn in hell? Surround yourself with those people and say, I have found the peaceful solution for the two states.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that bit about evangelicals, because I think sometimes, I've said it a couple of times, at gatherings, and people laugh, and I'm like, no. And since I'm not a comedian, that doesn't happen that often.
What, they laugh at what, the burn in hell?
They laugh at the idea that evangelicals that are pro-Israel for totally anti-Semitic, twisted, end of days reasons.
They're the number one donors to Israel.
And it's like, no. I really wish that I were kidding, that for some reason evangelicals have this, like, I just want Jews to have a homeland type shit. But no.
They just love people, right? All people.
The reason that evangelicals, and I'm not kidding. Like, when like South Park had that episode about Scientology, and then at the bottom it said, no, really, they believe this. That's what needs to be at the bottom of me saying this right now. No, really, they believe this. That in order for Jesus to come down and there to be this apocalypse and like the reckoning, all the Jews need to be back in Israel. I'm not kidding.
Right, and there's
and the Jews will then be like exterminated. So it's not like oh, we want to help the Jews get to heaven or whatever. Like, no, the Jews need to be in one place for easy targeting.
Yeah, easy targeting. So because Satan's only got a few missiles, so he wants to aim them at one spot.
And I appreciate his sort of clean cut way of going about things. Yes,
and there's literally evangelical tour groups that go over to Israel to show where the Bible says these things will happen, where the wars of lava and fire will happen, and they go to see where the Jews are going to burn. I mean, it's so fucking insane. And so he's doing this announcement. Now Trump is not religious. He's not. He has no ideology other than whatever helps him and hurts black and brown people. But he's sitting there with front row is Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo, two evangelicals who want to see the World War III because they believe it will result in the end times. They want to see all of the Jews in Israel, which also I think fits in with Trump announcing that Judaism is a nation, because that is an easier way to say go back to your nation, go back to your country, and send all of us.
Right.
Anybody born Jewish, whether you're an atheist now or a Christian now, doesn't fucking matter. Go on back to Israel so you can burn alive. And this, Max Blumenthal made a great point in an interview he did that this furthers anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
They act like this is a response to, oh, no, we need to stop anti-Semitism. Anybody who's against this two-state solution, quote unquote, is an anti-Semite. But in fact, this furthers anti-Semitism because it makes it seem like Israel is literally controlling U.S. foreign policy, can just tell the U.S. to declare whatever the fuck it wants, can treat Palestinians like this. It just furthers anti-Semitism in a big way. Furthermore, you have billionaire Jews like Sheldon Adelson sitting front row applauding as Trump does this. I mean, how does that not fucking horrible for any Jewish person in the world?
Well, yeah, and it also proves what is paramount here. It's not the respect of the Jewish faith or culture. It's the respect of the dollar, in specifically with regards to the military-industrial complex, and of this evangelical fucking bizarro end of days paradigm. So Adelson doesn't actually care about Jews. He cares about money. And this is good for his profit-making motive. And, of course, as you mentioned, Pompeo and Pence care about Jesus coming back and, I don't know, oiling him up and whatever kind of sick fantasies they have about Jesus, who was also a Jew, which makes it even more twisted. But, yeah, so this is just yet another sick example of, as you pointed out, Lee, Trump not really caring about the end goal as long as he gets a pat on the back from corporate media, which corporate media is incredibly Zionist as well, and getting a pat on the back from big corporations who love the war profiteers and the Israeli apartheid.
And the big thing for his ego is to say he did all these things. That's the main reason he wanted peace with North Korea, was so that, he definitely has a bit of a appreciation for authoritarian governments, but is so he could say, I did it. I created peace with North Korea. I created peace with Israel and Palestine. So he just wants to stamp his name on all this shit, but he's going to the only way he would ever consider doing that is by just bending over backwards for the rich and the powerful, which happens to be, Israel and certain billionaires that have his ear. So without seeing the map, so they've said there is a map. Israel has drawn a map of where these two sides will be, and Trump boasted about the fact that Palestine will actually increase its land compared to what it has now. But basically what this is it formalizes apartheid. It takes the Palestinians from where they currently live and I imagine leaves some of it to them, but takes a fair amount away, and the West Bank, etc., and then pushes them to the worst areas, the most desert, the most toughest to live in areas of Israel, and that's now their state. And so they can claim, oh, we have more land than we used to. Well, yeah, but you're still an apartheid state. Israel will still have the ability to cut off all of their, ability to build anything, their materials. And furthermore, there's a 4-year freeze, as Trump calls it, and the idea is, yes, it'll be a freeze in settlements, so the people who don't like the Israeli settlements, which is a form of taking over Palestinian areas, are happy about that. Oh, great, a freeze. But it also means that you move these Palestinians to these areas and they can't build. They can't do anything. It really has a lot of similarities to the Native Americans in the reservations when we first drove them there and basically said, you stay here and we'll decide whether you get any materials to do anything. And so the idea that people should be jumping up and down and saying, oh, it's a two-state solution, thank the Lord Almighty, is fucking bullshit. And another point that Max Blumenthal made, and he has a great book called Goliath, if you want a deep dive on Israel, is that Israel has always refused to draw a map of what this two-state solution would look like, because they didn't want to say that they agreed with any set lines. But that now, apparently, and I guess they're going to release it at some point, they have drawn a map. And the reason is because they feel so comfortable drawing a map that just fucks over the Palestinians that they've finally done it.
Well, and because, a big part of that is because you have the largest military in the world at your back. And so I think, if Israel didn't have billions of dollars of U.S. military aid coming in every fucking year, I don't think they'd be nearly as arrogant, particularly
right.
when they've done nothing but antagonize the Palestinian, well, antagonize sounds nice, oppress and destroy Palestinians for decades now. And they're no friend to other peoples in the region. So I think that that's an important point to make too. And I also, just because I can't say this enough, the issue that anti-Zionism is also a Jewish pastime. I think that it's important to continue to make the distinctions between Judaism and Zionism. And I'm not saying this as somebody who has who practices the Jewish faith, but somebody who is culturally Jewish.
Jewish pastime.
Well, so basically Zionism, and I think this is also an important thing to note, because yesterday was the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army. that Zionism is not something that happened during the Second World War. It's not something that happened because of the Second World War. Zionism was something that existed before that, and yes, it did come to
meaning a desire to create a
Jewish
state, yeah.
right around the historic grounds of Jerusalem and those places. This is something that's existed for quite some time, and thereby the Jewish resistance to Zionism has also existed, and there have been very long and deep fights and divisions inside the Jewish community about this, because a lot of Jews, for instance, those that were exterminated in the Second World War, didn't want to just fuck off to a place that they didn't feel that was home. Israel was not, or Palestine was not a place that they knew as home.
Right.
So many Jews felt that Zionism was just a bizarre way of, kind of like the New World with regards to Europe colonizing North America. That's
right,
not my home. I don't have any roots there. And Jews...
It's taken years of propaganda to make people think that every Jew wanted this.
And of course, it's different. I don't want to minimize this fact that Jews have had to move around so much because of the oppression that has been meted out against Jews. For instance, my own family, my dad did some research and found that his family, he traced them back to Spain around the time of the Inquisition. But beyond after that point, it's like we're over here in Europe, and then we're over here, and then we're over here, and they just fucking kept moving, not because they really liked wandering around, because they had to. And so I don't want to minimize the need for that moving around, but there was never this feeling that like, oh fuck it, we'll just go to Palestine. Like that wasn't something that these European Jews felt was like on the radar. And so Jewish communities have for a long time battled Zionism and felt that this was not something that they wanted to be a part of.
Yeah, and you just made me think of the connections to Jews being persecuted, and my grandmother, her second husband, so I guess my step-grandfather, who I knew very well, he fled the Holocaust to America from Germany, and he came here when he was 18 in the middle of New York, knowing no one. And he lost most of his family. I don't quite remember. I think his parents and maybe one of his sisters or something in the Holocaust. And then they, 10 or 15 years ago, they found in storage this picture someone had made, which it was just the names, but it was framed and everything of
a family tree.
Of like a family tree, and everyone who had died in the Holocaust was underlined in red, and like half of it was underlined in red. Yeah. I mean, it was pretty fucking crazy. But anyway, that was a side note, which actually brings us to our next topic. But in your notes, you have written, I've noticed, yesterday, Auschwitz liberated. And I feel like we were a little late on that. Like, I think we just should have gone in there earlier and really helped out those Jews.
Well, as someone once said, Americans late for every war, oversexed and overpaid. But here's the thing: Americans didn't liberate Auschwitz.
So wait, what was yesterday though? Was the anniversary?
Yesterday was the anniversary, January 27th, 1945. The Red Army liberated Auschwitz. Sorry, folks, the fucking commies liberated the Jews at Auschwitz. I know that doesn't like, oh God, like the whole like I hate
it
Russian.
It doesn't fit with the.
It's like oil and water. Like it just doesn't blend.
Russians are awful and evil.
But unfortunately,
I don't understand. I don't get it.
Unfortunately, that's what fucking happened. And I think that, even Bernie, who, let's be honest, isn't like a shining example of great foreign policy, but even he wrote on this day, so this was yesterday, he tweeted on this day, in 1945, the Allies liberated Auschwitz. And, it's like this sort of revisionist bullshit history is so dangerous because basically, for folks who haven't looked at it in a while or don't know, basically for every U.S. soldier, 80 Russian soldiers died.
So
27 million civilians died. How many American civilians? And it's not a matter of who matters more, but 27 million.
I want to stick on these numbers for a second. 27 million Russians died in World War II. Many of them were civilians, but they picked up a gun because what are you going to do when your fucking city is being taken over? And America lost something like it was somewhere between 250 and 500,000 people, which was 0.5% of our population. You know what percentage of the North Korean population we killed in the Korean War? 25 to 30%.
Mm-hmm.
So while we lost 0.5% of our population in World War II, the Russians lost 27 million people. And and here's something else is fairly shortly before his death, before his execution, John F. Kennedy acknowledged this in a speech and talked about how we needed peace with the Russians and they are, should be our allies, and how what they did for World War II, and he was in World War II also, and it basically acknowledged their what they gave to World War II, how important they were, and just a president saying that was like incredibly rare, and continues to be incredibly rare, and we continue to rewrite history as if only America and like Britain lost people in World War II.
Also, little side note, this is just kind of like one of those interesting historical footnotes, that Putin's mother was involved in the siege of Leningrad, which lasted like almost 3 years or something. It was a prolonged siege where people couldn't get basic foods into the city of Leningrad.
Lasted years.
Yeah, like almost. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like almost 3 years or something. And so people were dying of starvation very, very like frequently. And Putin's older brother died, and his mother nearly died during the siege of Leningrad, and she just barely survived, and then shortly thereafter gave birth to Vladimir Putin. That's just kind of like
crazy.
A little footnote of history. But I think this also speaks to how many people the World War II touched in Russia compared to how many people in the U.S. Like, there are no civilians basically in the U.S. that have a story like, oh, during the siege of... No, because there were no fucking sieges
unless they were a soldier, but at this point,
no, but like
to be
civilians in the U.S.
Civilians, yeah.
There are no stories like that. Like, oh, my home was bombed or some shit like that. Or I had to deal with a blockade with no food for almost 3 years. Like, there are no stories like that. And so to erase the Russian role in World War II is grotesque. And actually, I recently found this. I think I actually found it yesterday when I was doing some research. There was a 2015 Washington Post article that said, "Let's not forget that the Russians were the ones who beat the Nazis." That was the headline.
Hey.
But that was back in 2015.
Washington Post noticed something.
Remember, like, when McCarthyism wasn't a thing yet again, and you could, like, say something nice about the Russians without getting fucking
Do you remember
stoned?
that McCarthyism had gotten to had so dwindled and so disappeared that when Mitt Romney was asked during one of the debates what the greatest threat to America was, like military threat or whatnot, he said Russia. And both sides, both the Democrats and much of the Republican Party, mocked him for living in the past. They were like, apparently he's stuck in the 1980s. I don't know what the fuck this guy's talking about. But basically, faking some sort of hatred of Russia it wasn't useful then. They had largely, they viewed, Russia had become a capitalist country. It was, making oil deals with us. Rex Tillerson was getting awards in Russia for all of his oil shit he was doing. Like, they were like, yeah, we got some business deals going right now with Russia. And they were fine with it. So it wasn't useful. But now McCarthyism has come back because all of a sudden it's useful to basically crush anyone left of, fucking Chris Matthews on MSNBC. And if you're even slightly left of a Republican light, then you have to be crushed by the neo-McCarthyism.
Yeah, so important thing to note there, and also that the way that you stop things like Auschwitz from happening is not by building up apartheid states. The way that you stop things like Auschwitz from happening is that you fight fascism clearly and resolutely. And you fight injustices like what Israel is doing. And you fight it regardless of who is doing the wrong. You fight it because it is wrong. Like Chris Hedges said, I do not fight fascists because I think I will win. I fight them because they are fascist. And it's so important for people, in particular Jews, to stand up and say that if you're a follower of the Jewish faith, then you can easily say, you can point to passages from the Torah that say very distinctly that you should, for instance, like what we read during Passover, that you should always take the side of the oppressor because, quote, you yourselves were once slaves in Egypt. And if you're just culturally Jewish, then understand that what happened to you is not a reason to try and mete that out against others. So I think it's vital that we recognize that and continue to make the strong demarcation between Zionism and Judaism and stand very clearly on the side of justice and not on the side of Zionism.
The only point in the Torah that I live by is, I think it's don't eat bacon when it's been cooked in its mother's milk or something. Yeah, I live staunchly.
Wait, I thought it was don't eat bacon if it's cooked in shrimp juice.
Shrimp juice.
Shrimp juice.
Shrimp juice.
I
do live adamantly by that. So that is the only Torah I
heard it
stick
here
to.
first, folks.
And this is the final point I'm going to make on Palestine because I think it needs to be remembered. For those of you that maybe are low information on Palestine and you I grew up this way, so I'm not surprised if there are still plenty of people out there that believe like, oh, Israel's just defending itself and the rockets hit sometimes and what are they going to do? Palestine is over 50% under 18. It's 50% children. And these people many of them are starving. They have electricity 4 hours a day. Only nowadays, 50 to 60% are allowed out for medical procedures where they need to go to a much better hospital in order to have those medical procedures. For example, breast cancer in the U.S., you only have like a 10 or 20% chance of dying from breast cancer in the U.S. now. In Palestine, you have an 80-some% chance of dying from breast cancer because they won't let them out to get the proper treatment for things like cancer. It is, and the food, they can't rebuild anything. So when buildings are obliterated, they just sit like that because they have no building materials. Like, it is a horror show. And it's done against children. And the stuff that was done during the Great March of Return, where they're just snipers just killing people, unarmed people, those would be war crimes if it were in a war. If it were during a full-on declared war between two sides, you can't just shoot unarmed children, medics journalists, old people in the infirm.
Disabled.
Yeah, you can't just kill them unarmed while they're approaching you, and that's in a war. And this was not a fucking war. It was a parade. It was a march of people at the fence.
Who, at the very worst, were carrying Palestinian flags that might have had a pointy end on the stick.
They did throw rocks, but guess what? You can't kill people for throwing fucking rocks.
Well, no, and as there are classic images of stone throwers going up against tanks, and there are several stories about children who are throwing stones at Israeli tanks that are driving through the streets of Palestine that then get mowed down by these tanks.
The kids,
the kids get killed by these tanks because they're throwing stones at an occupying force. So yeah, there's no, as soon as you start scratching the surface and looking at the realities on the ground there, it's very clear that Israel is an apartheid state. They are vehemently and grotesquely oppressing Palestinians, and this has absolutely nothing to do with Judaism. It has everything to do with a sick settler colonialist power struggle, and that needs to be made abundantly clear.
Let's move on.
All right, let's move on.
Let's do it.
So the Democrats came up with
And we promised before the episode's out to get to either some good news or
We'll get to some good news.
or some weird news. We're gonna one of those is gonna happen.
the Democrats came up with a so-called Clean Future Act, which is one of those like right to work names that sounds really cool, but it's bullshit. And folks are basically saying that it should be called the Dirty Future Act, because as Lucas Ross from Friends of the Earth noted, Chairman Pallone's, who's one of the co-sponsors of the bill, said Chairman Pallone's plan is a gift to big oil and a recipe for another generation of fracking. So basically, this is one of those, yet again, it's one of those Democratic pieces of legislation that's wrapped in progressive speak and talking points and really is just a continuation of the status quo. It's what folks are calling extremely disappointing and, quote, a failure of climate leadership, as if the Democrats ever had climate leadership in the first place.
So what was this put forward in the House? Was that what happened?
Yeah, so this was put forward in the House, and folks have just gotten a chance to look at it and basically are saying this is bullshit.
Are they still calling fracking a bridge fuel, probably?
Basically, there's insight, and I don't have the exact verbiage here, but I'm looking at a Common Dreams expose on this, and it says that one of the problems is that there's a very vague and lax definition of clean energy. So the plan basically leaves the door wide open for fracked gas and potentially even some clean coal. Because, that's clean.
That's like military intelligence.
Exactly. And so basically this is even less progressive than the Obama administration's plan for the 2030 targets that Obama put into place, which, if you know anything about Obama's plan, it was also bullshit and flaccid and not good enough. So this is even less progressive than that plan. And, emission standards look good when you compare them to Trump's. But again, this is kind of where the Democrats excel, right? They excel in saying, well, look at what Trump is doing, or look what this Republican is doing. We're going to do better, and we're going to be more progressive. It's not hard to be more fucking progressive than Trump, because all you have to do is say that you believe in climate change, and abracadabra, you fucking created a progressive climate plan.
Well, and they basically do whatever decision they come up with on plans like this, on healthcare, etc. It is designed to still get corporate dollars. So basically, how can we act like we're for green energy while getting big oil to continue to support us? How can we act like we're for healthcare while getting big insurance to continue to support us?
And an important thing to note here that I've also talked about, I've written articles about this and talked about it on my show also, is the issue of biomass, which is also something that's pretty popular in Sweden, which is my other home country, so to speak. And biomass is basically fuel that's taken from things like trees. And so the logging industry loves this kind of shit because it's like, oh, instead of burning coal, we're burning biomass. And that's so much better. The problem is, no, you're still fucking logging trees. And in a lot of cases, you're logging old growth forests like we see in the north of California, in the Pacific Northwest with regards to old redwood forests, some of the only ancient forests still existing on this continent. And that's considered green.
Yeah, they burned a lot of biomass in Australia recently. That didn't really help things.
And that's the problem. It's the definition. Like Lee has a joke about how Trump has combated poverty. Well, you just changed the definition of poverty. Well, the Democrats have created a clean energy plan by changing the definition of what clean energy is. And this is so typically
point. So it's no longer clean energy. It's just
right. And this is so typically the Democrats, right? And I think it's so important that as we move forward with the 2020 elections, that we really keep this in mind, because this is the MO of the Democrats, to wrap something in a progressive guise, in a progressive veil, and serve it up to the people and just hope that we don't dig deeper. But we have to, because when you dig deeper, you see so many disgusting parallels between the Dems and the Republicans.
So well said, which brings us to our next question. And I think this was a listener proposed question.
It was.
Of how will you vote? Clearly, neither of us are huge fans of the Democrats or the Republicans. So how would one vote? One point I'd like to make in terms of this is that I kind of think there's the Democrats and there's the Republicans, which, as the point we were just making, is, they agree on 80-90% of the basic issues of this country, even if they pretend as if they don't. And then there's someone like Bernie Sanders, who is not really a Democrat. He's remained an independent in the Senate, perhaps one of the only ones, for years, for almost his entire time there. He would caucus with the Democrats. But even after his last run for president, he then went back to calling himself an independent. And so I do think there's a little bit of space there between him and the Democrats.
I would agree, but I also think it's important to note that if you look historically, Bernie is a Democrat. And the Democrats aren't. I mean, people like to say things like, "Oh, Bernie's."
You mean like, yeah. I was
people.
talking
People
current
like
day.
to say that like Bernie's more like a Swede or a which I'm currently working on an article that points out no, but if you just look at American, if you just look at U.S. history, Bernie isn't even as progressive as, somebody from the 50s that suggested, a 90% tax rate on the wealthy. So, I mean, even if you look at our own fucking history, which the U.S. is really incapable of doing, then you find that Bernie isn't even that progressive. And so I think
Right, but I meant the current.
Right.
I was talking the current definition of Democrat,
but
which is basically a Republican light.
Right, but I just feel that it's important to point that out because as we continue to ignore history, we continue to repeat it in the worst ways. You never repeat history in a fun, exciting way. It's always a shitty way. So, but in terms of, I'd say so this question was, how do you think people should vote and what's your process? And I recently did a piece that basically ended with, there's no such thing as a perfect candidate. But there are candidates that have pushed for justice, that do push for justice, and that can be pushed towards justice. And by that, I mean candidates that are malleable enough to accept and hear the requests and needs of their constituents and push for those. And I think for the most part, Sanders is that candidate. I think that he has shown in several instances, be that I believe it was in 2016 during a Black Lives Matter interruption of one of his speaking engagements, he just let these two Black women take the mic and use that mic to accentuate their deep-seated and horrible issues with the system, as opposed to another candidate who would probably have just let them be dragged off stage. And I'm not saying that means, he's some kind of fucking god, but it's I think that we need to look at these instances in people's past and how that relates to what they're talking about the future, and see if they have stood up for justice, how they've stood up for justice, and whether they seem like a malleable candidate in terms of working towards that.
Well, first of all, it would be different if I lived in a state that mattered, and my vote mattered in that way in terms of the presidential election. Then that would be a different decision to make, and I would likely, or almost definitely, vote for Sanders if you were in. I mean, either one. If you were voting in the Democratic primary, so therefore, you're going to vote for a Democratic candidate in the primary, you've already made that choice, then Sanders is the only one that seems even to be a rational choice, other than there are some positive things about Tulsi Gabbard. But then in the general election, if let's say Bernie Sanders were to be in the general election, I think I would look at it differently today than I would have 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago, I knew that climate change was a problem, but they hadn't yet come out with these timelines, or they weren't as certain about them. And now the timeline is really 10 years and it's done. And our extinction is inevitable. So in a way, it's like, is there a candidate, if you get to the general election, that seems like they might do anything about climate change? If Sanders is in the general election, I don't see any other hope for doing fucking shit all about climate change.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something that reminds me of an important thing to note, that voting doesn't matter unless there's an ultimatum attached to your vote. If you go and you cast your vote and you say, I'm done, I wipe my hands of this whole political engagement thing, then don't vote. It's a fucking waste of time. It's a waste of time for all of the people that you then say later to, I did my due diligence, because you fucking didn't. If voting is the only way that you, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be a dick about this, because we don't have enough time for me to be nice.
Oh, come on. We're
as
a
dick, species.
We're a dick about a lot of things. This is not the only thing.
But voting is only as good as the ultimatum that you deliver when you cast your ballot. And when you say, this is what I demand these basic human rights, and if I don't get them, there will be hell to pay. If that is not an ultimatum that you give when you vote, stay fucking home. Just stay home. And I think that, and I'm not sitting here saying that I'm going to vote for Sanders. I'm saying that this is my sort of perspective on the voting apparatus. I'm not saying that I'm going to vote for, or that I'm going to vote. I think that for me, my personal decision has yet to be made. And I don't know that I'll be sharing that publicly, because I think everybody should make up their own minds about how to vote, if they want to vote, etc. But I do stand by that idea that there's no perfect candidate, that candidates will be pushed towards justice if you push them. And that's the key ingredient here. If you don't push anybody, then it doesn't fucking matter whether you vote or not. Because I've seen people out in the streets that have never voted a day in their lives. And yet the fact that they are out there on the streets is what matters. And if you're casting a ballot and you never go to a protest, you never engage yourself outside of the ballot box, then you are not doing your fucking job.
And another point that you've made more on this show than I have is that it's voting is just something you do as a citizen that you should be involved in, but you shouldn't look at it as like you've done some major event, like you fucking tackled a cop who was about to murder someone or something. Like it's just something you do as a civic duty, but it is a tiny thing, and real change from a small number of individuals comes from other areas. And that's where you get into the Green Party and stuff. It's like, no, the Green Party is not going to win the presidential election. I'm sorry. That's not in the cards. But if you look at where the ideas are coming, the actual ideas that are the progressive side of the Democratic Party that actually matter, that aren't fucking horseshit, a lot of them come from the Green Party. Now, the Green New Deal has been heavily watered down, but the fact that it's even being talked about, a Green New Deal is even talked about, is the Green Party. The Medicare for All comes from either the Green Party or Green Party attached activists who have worked with, so I'm not saying that this is all direct from the party itself, but, activists who have often had something to do with the Green Party have come up with these ideas, have fought for net neutrality, probably helped make net neutrality a national talking point. Like, there's so many layers of things that change and the battle of ideas across this country that have come from those folks involved in the Green Party, there are some other parties that are outside of the mainstream, and other activist groups that are they're not getting elected to the big offices, all right? You're not going to see the Freedom for Assange group get elected to Senate. But these are important ideas that have gotten into the mainstream, and ultimately you push what's allowable in the country and what politicians feel comfortable doing and what politicians are feeling a pressure to do, based on those things. real change is not going to come from, voting for that Democrat, but
Right.
you vote as a tiny civic duty of a thing you do.
And I think you make a great point, that idea that change comes from the radicals. It was considered radical to allow black folks to vote. It was considered radical to allow women to vote. It was considered radical to not have children in coal mines and factories. That was considered a radical idea.
I thought you meant they were having the children in the coal mine. I was like,
I mean,
Jesus
maybe.
Christ, that
I
does
wouldn't
sound.
be surprised.
That
You wouldn't
does
get the
sound
day
radical.
off.
That does sound radical. No, you don't get a day off. Just have the kid in the fucking tunnel.
Isn't that the start to Texas Chainsaw Massacre? She's like working in a slaughterhouse, and then she just like has the kid.
Oh God.
Anyway.
I never saw it.
Anyway, that to me is a typical American story right there. But
They don't even give you a day off on the Chainsaw Massacre. Christ.
These ideas were considered to be radical, and they weren't pushed by the establishment. They were pushed by, in a lot of instances, if you look historically, like folks in the anarchist movement, Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, Voltairine de Cleyre, these ideas that now we consider, well, of course you wouldn't let a fucking 10-year-old into a factory. Not that the U.S. has any factories anymore, but that was considered to be radical at that time. So you have to have these radical perspectives pushing progress. Otherwise, you reach stagnation, which is why in our system that is an oligarchy that has been evidenced by various amounts of research, that we are in a place of stagnation. You only have to look at Congress. There's a extreme level of stagnation because we don't have the voices of these radical groups that are pushing the envelope, that are pushing for progress. And I think that's something that's so vital to really keep in mind. And this pushing happens outside of the ballot box. There's no pushing in a ballot box. There's checking a box in a ballot box, but there's no pushing.
Damn straight. And you made a great point about what we used to be viewed as the norm and is now viewed as a horror show like child labor. And it just made me think, and maybe this is getting too far off the topic, but I think that in the future, a couple of things we will view as a total horror show, that why were we ever okay with that, is going to be having a state based completely on religion that creates an apartheid state against others. I think that will be viewed as extreme, as insane many years from now. And another would be torture farming, our factory farming process of locking up animals their entire lives in its cells that aren't big enough to turn around, and so that they fucking, give birth to their babies and are like standing on them because they can't move. I think one day we will view that as terrible, if not worse, than child labor and so many other things. So anyway, couple of predictions. Hit me back in 20 years and see if I was right.
If we're all still alive.
All right, a couple of quick things before we get to the good news. If you feel like you've gotten a few dollars out of this show, please go to patreon.com/commoncensored. You'll notice there's no ads on this show. There's no sponsors. There's no corporations up our asses. There is nothing going on for this show, keeping this show going, except for you all. And it's really just a tiny number of you that see fit to keep this show going by joining us over at patreon.com/commoncensored. And that's all we need, but we need it. So patreon.com/commoncensored. And another thing, my new book is shipping. It's now shipping to those who bought it or continue.
So exciting.
Or continue to buy it at leecampbook.com. Click on either the US or the UK site, and that'll take you to PM Press, the publisher, and you can buy it direct from them.
It's totally rad.
Won't have to go through any of our shitty corporations like Amazon. You can go to leecampbook.com, and that will ship to you almost immediately, I think. It's not in stores until March, but even then it will only be in cool stores because Barnes & Noble don't give a fuck. They are not carrying my book. Couple other things. We have live shows coming up, or at least, Eleanor is not going to be on all of these, but Dallas, Austin, Texas, that's in 1 month. Flagstaff, and I think we're adding Tucson tickets soon. Montreal, Columbus, Toronto, Pittsburgh, I think Columbus. Did I say Columbus? Yeah, maybe we're adding, I think we're adding Cleveland. We're trying to add Cleveland. Burlington, Ottawa, Asheville. That's all at redactedtour.com, redactedtour.com, and you can you can vote for your city to be added. To get all Eleanor's stuff, and Eleanor has an incredible article on coal country. We talked a little about coal in this show, but she went there. She spent time with the people. She learned things that I never knew about coal country. That's at artkillingapathy.com. You can get all of her work, and it was published in Roar magazine, artkillingapathy.com. If you have ideas or questions, commoncensored at protonmail.com. Please review us on whatever platform you're using, iTunes or whatever. And lastly, text the word censored to 33777, and that will get you signed up to our free email list.
Okay, so to wrap, we are going to give you 2 good news stories and then 1 hilarious good news story. So we're gonna end on a
wow.
We're gonna end on an upswing.
Really?
Yes, we are. We're gonna blast through this because it's good news.
Can we say negative things about the good news? Like, oh yeah, all our water's dying, but that guy got a glass of water.
No.
Oh, shit.
So good news.
Have to maintain positivity.
Florida is actually going to purchase 20,000 acres of Everglades wetlands in order to prevent oil drilling. I know.
That's pretty incredible.
That sounds bananas because Florida, yes, Florida, the place that you're not allowed to mention climate change in any legislative verbiage because it's not a thing. They're actually, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection.
Are they putting an amusement park on it, though? The wetlands? Is it a giant slip and slide?
Basically, they're not tying it to climate change, but the idea is that they see the writing on the wall or the
shit smeared on the wall.
Whatever. The water rising, and so basically the wetlands that are affected are located in the Water Conservation Area 3, which is one of those typically boring fucking names. And it was previously owned by a corporation called Cantor Real Estate. And so they reached a deal with the Florida DEP to acquire those, for the DEP to acquire those lands so that they could basically save, and that this is basically a statement from the DEP that says, quote, "This significant purchase will permanently save these lands from oil drilling. I'm proud of our progress, and I recognize that this is just the beginning. I will continue to fight for the Everglades and Florida's environment." So again, no specific mention of climate change, but it is a very significant move in protecting the Everglades and these wetlands, which are a huge barrier to flooding and to environmental destruction. So this is really great news.
Yeah, and You mentioned a barrier to flooding and things like that, and a lot of people don't understand that the way these wetlands grow with the mangrove swamps and things like that, it slows hurricanes and it slows hurricane destruction. So when oil companies go in there, they gut everything, tear apart everything, and leave it as basically a nothing area that then when hurricanes come in, they just fucking tear through it and get stronger. And so they actually think that Hurricane Katrina would not have ended as it did without the gutting of the mangrove swamps and wetlands around Louisiana.
Absolutely.
But another point I was going to make is it's possible. I don't know. I know this Republican governor, but I don't know what specifically went into making the decision. But it might be that these people don't even believe in climate change or don't care about the science of it because there are so many other reasons that oil companies should not be tearing apart these wetlands. Another one that Florida has dealt with heavily because it fucks up their tourism is they've had these massive red tide blooms in the water, which makes the water toxic. And they don't like to talk about this, but it can also make the air up to like a mile inland toxic because the wind blows across the top of the water, picks up the stuff, puts it in your lungs. All of a sudden, you have this red tide growth in your lungs, and and they act like it's not a big deal. They're just like, oh, if you find dead fish on the beach, don't eat them. and there's dead fish everywhere. They've had terrible ones recently, these red tides, and the reason is because of fucking corporations dumping, agricultural dumping, and basically they pour chemicals and manure and all kinds of shit into these waters, and that facilitates these red tide blooms, which kill everything in the water, create ocean dead zones, kill all the fish wash up, and nobody wants to go to Florida because the beaches smell like goddamn ass because it's just dead fish and you can't go in the water. And so, yeah, Florida is not a lot of fun when those things are going on.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I don't want to go to Florida, full stop. But it's just me. Stick me in an ice floe and I'm happy. I was not made for the age of climate change. But
hey, we have people listening right now in Florida who resent that remark.
And that's great. I won't be your neighbor, but we can still be friends. It's cool. You probably wouldn't want to.
My neighbor.
You would probably not want to live with me in the fucking Arctic Circle. But yeah, I think that it's impossible to know what kind of profit motive is behind this. And I will say that it's a tactic that's been used by a lot of activists in the past, and it has worked to point out to folks, like for example, whether that be the Great Barrier Reef or the bayous in Louisiana, not that it's saved them, but this idea that, hey, tourism is a huge money pull, and if you contaminate these places so that they're just toxic waste dumps, then nobody's going to be spending that sweet tourism cash. So yeah, I think you make a good point, Lee. There's no such thing as just altruism inside a capitalist system. So yeah, there is probably a capitalist perspective behind this.
I wasn't saying, I don't know whether it's climate change or not. I'm just saying there's other reasons.
Of course. But I think also I just want to point out
Last story coming up.
That this wetland acquisition will protect the wildlife habitat of more than 60 endangered and threatened species. And will support expedited restoration work on the Everglades. So that's really fucking awesome. Okay. Mauna Kea, next story. Mauna Kea Telescope Project. You may have heard about this last year. A bunch of indigenous groups in Hawaii and, of course, solidarity groups around the world were supporting those indigenous folks that were fighting against the construction of a ginormous telescope on top of one of their sacred mountains, Mauna Kea.
One of the largest telescopes ever built was going to be built on this sacred mountaintop. And, on one hand, people fight for the exploration of space, the understanding of space, and they were saying, oh, we need to be up there. And on the other hand, indigenous were like, it's our fucking land and it's holy to us and we don't want it there.
Well, and I think there's a larger conversation that you could have about this, but for the time being, that project has been halted, and that is good news. And I think I can sum this up pretty quickly, that in a world where folks are being vehemently oppressed by colonialism, and this is doubly true in Hawaii in terms of both colonialism against the indigenous folks, and then just the rabid acquisition of Alaska as a state by the United States. In a world where this sort of oppression is rampant, we can't just say, let's shove that aside and look out to space. I think space exploration is awesome. I fucking love it. I subscribe to science magazines. I nerd out on black holes and all of that shit, and black matter or dark matter and dark energy. I fucking love that shit. But you can't just cast that aside when people are being oppressed and colonized and imperialism is rampant. You have to deal with that shit. And then as a collective effort of humanity, look to space and ask those awesome questions. But we can't just pretend that the oppression of these indigenous peoples doesn't matter because space.
I like your dark energy that you just gave in that.
Thank you.
In that treatise. Yeah, and I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson's discussion of this before this decision was made. So he had not. It was before they had decided not to go forward. For now, I'm sure the fight will continue. And he was arguing for the telescope, and he was basically acting like these people are uninformed. I mean, he wasn't being mean to them. He wasn't calling them idiots or anything, but he was acting like, oh, they're uninformed. And I think if we just sat down and explained how important this is and what can be learned from this telescope and things like that, I think they would understand that this is important. It's important to humanity and things like that. And it didn't seem he had any understanding of what it's like to be these indigenous who have had their land so traumatized and stolen from them and colonized and taken over, and their cultures destroyed in so many ways. And he just wasn't, it'd be one thing if you were being like, oh, I understand all of that, but also I think A, B, and C. It seemed like there was not an understanding of just what it means to have your culture ripped apart, and then have some people go, yeah, but it's good for science.
Right.
So I'm sure that we can put very good telescopes somewhere else on the planet.
Yeah, indeed we can. And I'm just going to read this really quick because this is such an amazing story. I promise then we're done. San Jose, California.
We're setting a record episode here, I think.
Actually not. We're only at 65 minutes, so calm down. So in San Jose...
I just peed my pants.
Well, that's your problem. You should start wearing Depends. In San Jose, California, roughly a little bit more than a week ago...
All right, we'll do the story, but don't read it fast like we're trying to win something.
Furries pulled assaulter out of vehicle and sat on him. That's the headline. I'm not kidding. Go to mercurynews.com.
What a great...
Let me just explain
You got to explain what furries are.
Furries are
Most
people who
people
dress
don't
up
know.
in animal costumes. There was a fur con. No, I'm serious. That's what it's called. There was a fur con
What fur?
in San Jose.
Oh, you missed my best pun of the episode.
Okay. There was a fur con in San Jose, and so these people were dressed up in costumes. I'll just read this little excerpt, and then we'll just leave it. I'm just going to leave it out there.
You're just going to, like a fucking dick on the table. You're just going to put this out there.
Exactly. Or a fucking zebra tail.
Hold on. I just want, because it helps the headline make sense and the whole story makes sense. People have to understand, who have never heard of these. Literally, there are human beings that just dress up in furry costumes, and that's like their number one activity. Like, most of their hobbies are dressing up in furry suits.
Right.
And they call themselves furries. And anyway.
So basically, they stepped in when they saw a man.
So they're on the sidewalk.
Yeah, they saw a
outfits.
man losing his shit and being very violent towards a female driver. And so it says, among the first on the scene was the pink dinosaur, who wrested the suspect by the head and shoulders while a massive tail bobbed in his wake. Then a tiger knelt to restrain the man from the torso as a platform-heeled cowboy watched on. Now, the cowboy is not a furry. He was just kind of like an ally of the furries, I guess. But
the platform-heeled cowboy was not at a con. He was just walking down the street.
He was just a guy in San Jose. But I just want to tell you, no matter what you're wearing, no matter what you're into, you can always stand up against bigotry and sexism of any kind.
Even
so
if you
just
stand up on all fours.
Yes. And even if you got a tail flapping in the wind, you too can fight fascism, sexism, racism, and bigotry. Good night.
Oh my God. Best ending to an episode ever.
I agree.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. Head on over to patreon.com/commoncensored and keep fighting.
Act out.